edition of The Future is Socialist. Today we're going to be talking about the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre.
Set upon Greenwood for 18 hours of mass murder, arson, and looting that would become known as the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. An estimated 300 African Americans were killed, over 1,000 injured. 10,000 left homeless as the racist mob, some of them deputized and armed by Tulsa law enforcement along with members of the Ku Klux Klan, terrorized the Black population. Airplanes were used to drop dynamite and crude incendiary bombs on Greenwood, ultimately burning over 35 city blocks. Over 1,200 homes were destroyed, along with countless businesses. The actual number of dead will never be known, as bodies were tossed into mass graves or thrown in the river. Last week, a House Judiciary Subcommittee held a hearing to address the ongoing impacts of the Tulsa Massacre. 3 African American survivors testified in favor of reparations. Viola Fletcher, her younger brother, Hughes Van Ellis, who's 100 years old, and 105-year-old Leslie Benningfield Randall. This is part of their testimony, beginning with Viola Fletcher.
I'm a survivor of the Tulsa Race Massacre. 2 weeks ago, I celebrated my 107th birthday. Today, I'm visiting Washington, D.C. for the first time in my life. I'm here seeking justice, and I'm asking my country to acknowledge what happened in Tulsa in 1921. The night of the massacre, I was awakened by my family. My parents and 5 siblings were there. I was told we had to leave, and that was it. I will never forget the violence of the white mob when we left our home. I still see Black men being shot, Black bodies lying in the street. I still smell smoke and see fire. I still see Black businesses being burned. I still hear airplanes flying overhead. I hear the screams. I have lived through the massacre every day. Our country may forget this history, but I cannot. I will not, and other survivors do not, and our descendants do not.
We live with it every day, and the thought of what Greenwood was and what it could have been. We aren't just black and white pictures on a screen. We are flesh and blood. I was there when it happened. I'm still here.
It seems like justice in America is always so slow or not possible for Black people.
3 African American survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre making history as they testified before Congress just ahead of the centennial of the Race Massacre this Monday. The Department of Homeland Security has said events commemorating the massacre could be a target for white supremacists. President Joe Biden still plans to travel to Tulsa on Tuesday. This Sunday, a documentary by award-winning filmmaker Stanley Nelson premieres on the History Channel. This is the trailer for Tulsa Burning, the 1921 Race Massacre.
The destruction was so complete. The suffering was so biblical. The betrayal was so profound.
Black communities deserve the opportunity to confront the past. Our city has been stuck. Since then, we've never recovered.
Tulsa was the best place in the nation for African Americans.
We have everything from hotels, theaters,
Doctors, lawyers.
people refer to it as Black Wall Street. Showing Black people that a new world was possible.
The Tribune published a story titled "Nab Negro for Attacking Girl in an Elevator." It was a false narrative to keep Black people in their place, to reinforce white supremacy.
All across Tulsa, angry whites are now organizing.
They get their guns, they get their torches.
At that point, they start moving towards Greenwood.
all hell broke loose.
And then it's the white folks are killing the colored folks.
Firing into homes.
Bombs dropping from the air.
It was just an all-out massacre.
Not one of those men who participated in the race massacre were ever brought to justice.
The Tulsa Tribune refused to write anything about the massacre for more than 50 years. Victims were being buried in unmarked graves across the city. The reason we understand the history of the massacre is that certain survivors decided to talk about it.
My mother saw 4 men coming toward our house, and all of them had torches.
We would be looking for the remains of those who were lost so tragically.
This is so beautiful and sad at the same time.
We need to do something about what happened in Tulsa.
There could not be any justice till there is proper respect, restitution, and repair.
The trailer for Tulsa Burning, the 1921 race massacre. The executive producer of the
Okay, so today marks the 100th year anniversary of the Tulsa race riot in what was known as Black Wall Street, also known as Greenwood. This is a tragedy that unfortunately has been hidden for a long time from people. And so we need to highlight this, the 100th year anniversary. As you saw, 3 of the witnesses who experienced this firsthand as children were speaking before a congressional hearing. We need to shed light on this, and we need to talk about this more. Okay. So next, what I'm going to share with you is an article from the Black Agenda Report. Remembering Tulsa by Tim Madigan. In 1921, thousands of whites attacked the Black population of Tulsa, Oklahoma with machine guns, airplanes, fire, and pure hatred, killing at least 300. Greenwood, known at the time as the Negro Wall Street of America, and on account of its affluence, resembled a city flattened by a massive bomb. At 5:08 a.m. on June 1st, 1921, a whistle pierced the pre-dawn quiet of Tulsa, Oklahoma. There was disagreement later about whether the sound came from a steam engine on the rim of a factory in the center of the booming oil town, but there was no doubting its meaning. It was the signal for as many as 10,000 armed white Tulsans, some dressed in army uniforms from their service in World War I, to attack the place known as Greenwood, the city's uniquely prosperous African-American community. From every place of shelter up and down the tracks came screaming, shouting men to join in the rush toward the Negro section, a white witness named Chalk Phillips later remembered. By dawn, machine guns were sweeping the valley with their murderous fire, recalled a Greenwood resident named Dimple Bush. Old women and men and children were running and screaming everywhere. The trouble had begun the day before. A Black teenage shoeshine boy named Dick Rowland had been arrested and charged with assaulting a white girl in an elevator of a downtown Tulsa building. Even white police detectives thought the accusation dubious. The consensus later was that whatever happened between them was innocuous, perhaps that Rowland had stepped on the toe of young Sarah Page when the elevator lurched. But that was academic after the Tulsa Tribune, one of the city's 2 white newspapers, ran an incendiary editorial under a headline residents remembered as "To Lynch Negro Tonight." That evening, Black community leaders met in the Greenwood newspaper office of A.J. Smitherman to discuss a response. Already a white mob had gathered outside the courthouse where Rowland was being held. Some African-American leaders counseled patience, citing the promise of Sheriff Willard McCullough to protect Rowland. Others wouldn't hear of it. A cadre of about 25 Black residents, some in their own army uniforms and carrying rifles, shotguns, pistols, axes, garden hose, and rakes, drove south from Greenwood and marched the final blocks to the courthouse and offered the sheriff their assistance. At about 10:30 p.m., when a second group of 75 or so residents marched to the courthouse, an elderly white man tried to grab the gun of a Black World War I veteran. A shot went off during the scuffle. Scores of other shots were fired in the panic that followed. Men, women, and children dove for cover behind trees and parked cars, but as many as a dozen people of both races ended up dead. By dawn, machine guns were sweeping the valley with their murderous fire. The Black marchers retreated to Greenwood. A lull set in at 2 a.m., but tensions rose in the hours of darkness. Then the whistle rang out. armed black residents hiding on the rooftops of the sturdy brown brick buildings lining Greenwood Avenue attempted to repel the white mob. But the mob not only had superior numbers, it also had machine guns, which were placed at elevated points on the edge of Greenwood, as well as biplanes, perhaps belonging to a local oil company, which circled overhead and rained bullets and dropped incendiaries. Members of the white mob, which included teenage boys and some women, went business to business, church to church, home to home, hefting weapons, torches, and containers of kerosene, rousting African-American shop owners and residents and killing those who resisted and some who did not. A white Tulsa resident named Walter Farrell, who was a boy at the time of the massacre, recalled years later how he used to play every day with 3 black children who lived across the street from him on the border of Greenwood. On the morning of June 1st, young Walter watched as a carload of white men entered the home of his friends. Then he heard a series of gunshots. He waited for his friends to flee from the flames engulfing their residence, but they never did. It's just too terrible to talk about, even decades later, Farrell told an interviewer in 1971. W.D. Williams was 16 years old at the time. His family owned the thriving Williams Confectionery at the corner of Greenwood Avenue and Archer Street. Just down the block was their Dreamland Theater. When the attack came, Williams fought next to his father, John, who fired down at armed invaders from an upper floor of the Williams building until the place was both their home and place of business was overrun. When the teenager eventually surrendered, he was marched down Greenwood Avenue with his hands in the air, past his family's flaming theater and candy store. He watched as a white looter emerged from his home with a fur coat belonging to his mother, Lula, stuffed inside a bag. Eldoris McCondichie was 9 years old on the morning of June 1st. She was roused early by her mother. "Eldoris, wake up," she said. "We have to go. The white people are killing the colored folks." Williams watched as a white looter emerged from his home with a fur coat belonging to his mother, Lula. On a morning nearly 80 years later, as I sat in her Tulsa living room, McCondichie remembered how she and her parents joined a long line of black people headed north along the railroad tracks, away from the advancing mob. Many were dressed only in nightclothes, clutching pets and family Bibles. She recalled that a plane appeared, buzzing low and spraying bullets, causing her to pull away from her father and flee into a chicken coop. Her father pulled her out and back into the line of refugees. McCondichie and her family returned to Greenwood a few days later and found their home among the few still standing, but almost everything else within eyesight had been reduced to piles of charred wood and rubble. "By now, I know better than to talk about that day without holding a few of these," she said, rising to take a handful of tissues. After the fires burned out, Greenwood, known at the time as the Negro on account of its affluence, resembled a city flattened by a massive bomb. The mob had burned more than 1,100 homes. 215 more were looted but not burned. 5 hotels, 31 restaurants, 4 drugstores, 8 doctors' offices, a new school, 24 grocery stores, Greenwood's hospital, its public library, and a dozen churches. In all, 35 square blocks were destroyed. Most of the area's 10,000 residents were left homeless. Estimates of losses in property and personal assets by today's standards range from 20 million to more than 200 million. A white Tulsa girl named Ruth Sigler Avery recalled a grim scene. "Cattle trucks heavily laden with bloody, dead black bodies," Avery wrote decades later in an unfinished memoir. "Some were naked, some dressed only in pants. They looked like they had been thrown upon the truck beds haphazardly, for arms and legs were sticking out through the slats. On the second truck, lying spread-eagled atop the high pile of corpses, I saw the body of a little black boy, barefooted, just about my age. Suddenly, the truck hit a manhole in the street. His head rolled over, facing me, staring as though he had been frightened to death." There is no complete tally of how many were killed. The best estimates put the number at as many as 300 people, the vast majority of them black. The exact number of casualties and the location of their remains may never be known. Many Greenwood families simply never saw or heard from their loved ones again and were condemned to live with uncertainty about their fate. That was the first act of Tulsa's willful forgetting, to bury the truth of what had happened. I first learned about the massacre 21 years ago as a reporter on the Fort Worth Star-Telegram from a wire service story about the Oklahoma Commission to study the Tulsa Race Riot of 1921. The commission was created in 1997 by the state legislature to document an event that few people knew much about apart from elderly survivors and those they had entrusted with their memories. I was incredulous. How could I have not known about something so horrible? I went to Tulsa to report on the massacre, and on that first trip and many that followed, I met with survivors such as Eldoris McCondichie and Kenny Booker and George Monroe, who were children during the massacre. I heard descendants compare Greenwood households to those of Holocaust survivors. Black children and grandchildren sensed a darkness but could only guess at the source of it. I spoke with a white historian named Scott Ellsworth, who had made uncovering the truth about what happened his life's work. And I sat down with Tulsa's Don Ross, a black Oklahoma state representative and a civil rights activist who had introduced the resolution to create the government commission, along with a state senator named Maxine Horner. On my first night in Tulsa, Ross and I had taken a table at a Chinese restaurant and were looking at menus when I asked what I thought was an innocent question. What was it like for African Americans after the Civil War? Ross brought his fist down on our table, loud enough to draw glances from people seated nearby. How can you not know these things? He asked, his voice rising. And you're one of the educated whites. If we can't count on you to understand, who can we count on? I spent much of the next year immersing myself in the story of the massacre in our country's racial history and went on to write a book about it, The Burning, published in 2001. I had been further astounded to learn that what happened in Tulsa was unique only in its scope. In the years leading to 1921, white mobs murdered African Americans on dozens of occasions in Chicago, Atlanta, Duluth, Charleston, and elsewhere. I also learned that at first Tulsa's white leaders were contrite. Tulsa can only redeem herself from the countrywide shame and the humiliation into which she is today plunged by complete restitution and rehabilitation of the destroyed Black Belt. Former Mayor Loyal J. Martin said days after the massacre. The rest of the United States must know that the real citizenship of Tulsa weeps at this unspeakable crime. But by July, the city had proposed building a new railroad station and white-owned manufacturing plants where Greenwood homes and businesses had stood. The Tulsa City Commission passed a new fire ordinance mandating that residential buildings be constructed with fireproof materials, an ostensible safety measure that had the effect of making it too expensive for many Black families to rebuild. It was only when Black lawyers rushed to block the ordinance in court that Greenwood could begin to come back to life. Then, in a matter of months, once reporters for national newspapers disappeared, the massacre disappeared with it, vanishing almost completely for more than half a century. The history has remained hard to find, as if the events are too horrible to look at and the depredations too great to comprehend. I returned to the subject in recent months as the 100-year anniversary drew near. I found that even at this time of social unrest, much has changed since I learned about the massacre 21 years. Events have forced this forgotten history into the nation's consciousness. There is a new willingness to confront it. Phil Armstrong is the project director for the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission, an organization working with the city and other partners to plan a 10-day commemoration scheduled to begin May 26th. Armstrong, the intersection of Greenwood Avenue and Archer Street, long known as Deep Greenwood. Construction workers there are now putting the finishing touches on Greenwood Rising, a gleaming new history center that will be dedicated on June 2nd. A quotation will adorn one exterior wall, words chosen in a poll of the community. We had about 5 different quotes from Martin Luther King Jr., from Desmond Tutu, from the Black historian Franklin, Armstrong told me. But this quote from James Baldwin far and away had the most votes. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Oh, James Baldwin. How I love you. The conspiracy of silence that prevailed for so long was practiced on a vast scale. But one day in the late 1950s at Tulsa's Booker T. Washington High School, during a meeting of the yearbook staff, W.D. Williams, a history teacher, could hold his tongue no longer. When I was a junior at Washington, the prom never happened because there was a riot, and the whites came over the tracks and wiped out Greenwood, Williams told a room full of students. In fact, this building was one of the few that wasn't burned, so they turned it into a hospital for colored folks. In those days, there were probably Negroes moaning and bleeding and dying in this very room. The whites over yonder burned Greenwood down, and with almost no help from anybody, the Negroes built it back to what it was. In the back of the room, a young pool hustler named Don Ross jumped up from his seat. Mr. Williams, I don't believe that, Ross remembered saying. I don't think you could burn this town down and have nobody know nothing. The next day, the teacher showed the teenager a scrapbook filled with photographs of charred corpses and burned out buildings. Williams soon introduced Ross to others who had lived through the massacre. As they drove one night to meet another survivor, Ross summoned the nerve to ask Williams how such a thing could have remained a secret. Because the killers are still in charge in this town, boy, Williams answered. Now you understand why anyone who lived through this once damn sure doesn't want to live through it all again. If you ask a Negro about the riot, he'll tell you what happened as if he knows who you are. But everyone's real careful about what they say. I hear the same is true for white folks, though I suspect their reasons are different. They're not afraid, just embarrassed. Or if they are afraid, it's not of dying, it's of going to jail. The historian Scott Ellsworth showed up at W.D. Williams' home in North Tulsa, the historically Black part of the city that includes the Greenwood District, in August of 1975. Ellsworth had heard whispers about a massacre while growing up in Tulsa in the 1960s, and he still didn't understand how an incident on a Tulsa elevator could lead to the destruction of an entire community. It was Ruth Sigler Avery who suggested talking with Williams. He had been looking all his life to tell his story, waiting for a professor from Howard University or Ohio State or a reporter from Ebony, and nobody ever came, Ellsworth told me last year. He sure wasn't waiting for me. At Williams' kitchen table, Ellsworth laid out a painstakingly drawn map of Greenwood as it existed in 1921. He is now wide-eyed, in a trance, because this is a map of his childhood, Ellsworth recalled. Then he looks up and says, "Tell me what you want to know." I had made the cut with him. That was the moment when we saved the history of the riot. At the time, the event in Tulsa was known, to the extent it was known at all, as a race riot, always a gross misnomer. Facts mattered to W.D. Williams, Ellsworth told me. I don't recall any particular emotionality or outward catharsis on his part. Sitting there at his kitchen table, he was completely changing the narrative that had held sway for more than a half a century, and he wanted to make sure that I got it right. That interview was the first of dozens Ellsworth conducted with massacre survivors and witnesses, conversations that became the heart of his groundbreaking book, Death in a Promised Land, The Tulsa Race Riot of 1921, published by LSU Press in 1982. It had an underground existence, Ellsworth said of his book. Every year, it was one of the most stolen books from the Tulsa library system. Every year, I would send them a new box. Ellsworth's long-awaited follow-up, The Groundbreaking, will be published this May. In 1995, thanks to Death in a Promised Land, an awareness of the massacre went more mainstream after an Army veteran named Timothy McVeigh detonated a bomb outside a federal building in downtown Oklahoma City. The attack killed 168 people, including 19 children attending a daycare center in the building. Nearly 600 other people were injured. The national news media descended on the city to cover what was described as the worst act of domestic terrorism in American history. Don Ross, by then a state legislator who for years had represented the district that included Greenwood, believed that America's worst domestic atrocity had happened 74 years earlier in Tulsa. A few days after the Oklahoma City bombing, Ross met with Bryant Gumbel, host of NBC's Today Show, and handed him a copy of Death in a Promised Land. Today went on to produce a segment about the massacre for its 75th anniversary the following year. Amid the publicity that followed, Ross co-sponsored the resolution in the Oklahoma legislature that led to the Tulsa Race Riot Commission. The 11-member commission had two main advisors, John Hope Franklin, a revered African-American historian and a Tulsa native, and Scott Ellsworth. When 2 years later, the commission announced that it would begin investigating possible sites of mass graves, the public response was enormous, as if the pent-up pain of keeping such secrets had finally exploded into the daylight. Hundreds of people contacted commission investigators, many of them wanting to share personal memories of the massacre and how it had affected their families over the years. The commission discovered reams of government and legal documents that had been hidden away for decades. Each opened an avenue into another corner of history, Danny Goebel, a historian, wrote in the commission's final report. The commission concluded that there was no doubt white Tulsa officials were to blame for the massacre. They not only failed to prevent the bloodshed, but had also deputized white civilians who took part in the burning and killing. And yet not one white person was brought to justice for the atrocities. The commission's 200-page report was submitted to state and city officials on February 28, 2001. The silence is shattered, utterly and permanently shattered, Goebel wrote. Whatever else this commission has achieved or will achieve, it has already made that possible. Even so, there remains an unmistakable sense among Tulsa's Black community that important steps were left untaken. The commission recommended financial reparations for survivors and their descendants, a suggestion that state and local officials rejected. As Tulsa prepares to commemorate the 100-year anniversary of the massacre, the question of restitution remains unanswered. One gray afternoon last fall, I stood at the intersection of Greenwood and Archer. It was a cold day with low clouds and the occasional spit of rain. A red construction crane towered over the intersection where work had begun on Greenwood Rising. There was a 3-story Williams building, circa 1922, rebuilt to resemble the original. Next door was Black Wall Street t-shirt and souvenir store. Farther down Greenwood Avenue was a hamburger place, a beauty salon, and a real estate office. 2 blocks north, I walked beneath the ugly concrete gash of a freeway overpass that has divided Tulsa's African-American community for decades. Close by was a baseball stadium, home of the Drillers, Tulsa's minor league team, and a sprawling apartment complexes under construction. The neighborhood's gentrification is a source of resentment among many longtime Black residents. Small bronze plaques were set into the sidewalks up and down Greenwood Avenue and Archer Street. I might have missed them entirely if passersby hadn't pointed them out. Don Ross has been involved in putting the first one down 30 years ago. Each commemorates the location of a business before June 1st, 1921. Theater, Nails Brothers Shoe Shop, Dr. Richard Walker, Abbott Printing, Colored Insurance Association, Hooker Photography, CL Netherland, Barber, Hughes Cafe, Gurley Hotel, the Williams Building, Attorney I.H. Spears. The little monuments, one after another down the street, had a stark but beautiful power. Each one noted whether or not the business had ever been revived. By my count, in just these few blocks, 49 had reopened after the massacre. 29 had not. Okay, and you can read the rest of the article on your own. So that's what I wanted to talk about today was the Tulsa Massacre. We need to remember these things so that we can prevent them from happening again. You know, history is our best teacher. We don't want to be condemned to rebuilding. We need to rebuild the Black Wall Street. I thank you for listening to this today, and I hope that you have a safe holiday today. Please remember the 300 plus people who perished through no fault of their own, through a race riot 100 years ago today. Thank you.